Welcome back. In the last lecture, we looked at some theoretical formulations, philosophical accounts of the problem of evil that were very, very abstract, but as I tried to say, they have some very, very powerful and fundamental real-world implications about thinking about the nature of evil and the inner psychology of evil. Now I want to look at a different genre entirely, an epic poem on these topics, which is beautiful and on its surface amazing, but also incredibly profound about the philosophical and theological depths of the problem of evil. Dante Alighieri certainly deserves to be counted as among the most powerful, expositive, theological minds of the history of Christianity. That is, one of the most powerful describers of what this tradition has thought about evil. And also about goodness and blessedness, too, in his Paradiso. He's fantastic on that. But here, we're going to stay entirely in hell. Dante's vision of hell, in his epic poem, The Inferno, has probably done more to shape Western imaginations of hell, demons, the devil, and punishment than any other work. In this lecture, I want to look at three themes in this poem. First of all, the overall logic of hell, the conceptual architecture of it, as it were. The paradoxical logic of what he calls the contrapasso, the counter penalty, which is at the heart of the nature of punishment in hell for Dante. And then, last but certainly not least, the ultimate irony and, I would say, in some important ways, the joke on the devil that is at the heart of the whole poem and that many people, perhaps understandably, miss. But let me give you something of Dante's background here. He lived from 1265 to 1321, thereabouts. In other words, he overlapped with Aquinas by about 10 years, because Aquinas dies in 1275. And Dante was a Florentine. He was politically engaged, interested in keeping Florence free from outside influence. He served in its army, as all young men would. And when he was 9 years old, of course, he met and fell in love with Beatrice Portinari. She was actually younger than 9. So this is like a 9-year-old and a 7-year-old. Imagine a 9-year-old's love for a 7-year-old provoking what turns out to be this incredible divine comedy, right? The three incredible poems of the Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. Beatrice turns out to be the inspiration, the emotional and, in some ways, intellectual inspiration for Dante's entire life, although he never actually really gets to know her very well. Eventually, in his life as an active citizen of Florence, the intrigues of the city went against him. And in 1301, on a mission in Rome, Florence fell to a strong group of pro-papacy Florentines. Dante was not among them. He was in Rome. And Dante never set foot in his home city again. Interestingly, the city council of Florence finally rescinded the punishment of exile on pain of torture and death if he returned to Dante. They finally got him off the hook on that. But you know when they did it? In 2008. Dante fled to northern Italy and lived in a series of cities. He eventually died and was buried in Ravenna, an exile where his tomb remains, even today, guarded by the police of Ravenna, who are afraid that some Florentines will try to come and steal his bones back. The Inferno is part of the Commedia, the Divina Commedia, the Divine Comedy, although that's not a term Dante seems to have given it. He just called it the Commedia, a story of how a man at the midpoint of our lives' journey, around 35 years old, for Dante, just before he was exiled, seems to be facing a crisis of faith, of identity, some sort of massive psychological crisis. And he is shown mercy by an old love, Beatrice, who is now in heaven, and is shown that mercy by being taught the true nature of reality in guided tours of hell, purgatory, and paradise. The Inferno begins this larger story. It turns out that you really do need to go through hell to get to heaven. That is, to understand the proper nature of the cosmos and your place in it, you must understand it from where everything ends up, from everything's ultimate destiny. And some things don't end well. So first, let's look at Dante's understanding in the Inferno of the meaning and legitimacy of hell and its overall logic. It's important to know that even though hell is the reason most people read the Inferno, the real story of the poem itself is in fact the moral and spiritual development of the character Dante in the poem. Right? The character Dante in the poem is reported as growing in wisdom throughout all three poems, but for our purposes really in hell. The maturation of this character is really what the poem is about. Right? People should see that the great imaginative achievement of the poem is not then the pictorial representation of hell it offers, but the deepening appreciation of the meaning of reality that the character Dante undergoes. And this is important because by noticing the way that certain language changes for him in significance over the length of the poem, we begin to see how that maturation happens. One important way it does is by noticing the way that Dante changes his understanding of the meaning and true significance of the word pietà. In Italian, especially in late medieval Italian, pietà means both piety and pity. Now, what does it mean that piety, a religious sensitivity, and pity, a this-worldly affective sensitivity, a sensibility to other people's suffering, are lexically identical for Dante? Well, that suggests a tight connection between religious rectitude, religious propriety, and proper emotional responses to situations. Dante agrees with that. But whereas you and I might think that that means that our religious responses must become as sensitive to reality as our emotional ones, Dante proposes that things should go in the opposite direction. That is, that we have to correct our emotional responses, our affective responses to situations, in order to have them align to the proper religious ones. And that means centrally that in hell, we should not be nice to the damned. There's a great example of this early in the poem, in Canto 5, in the fifth song, in the fifth chapter. There's the famous story of Paolo and Francesca. These are adulterers who have a sexual affair prompted by their reading together a medieval romance. And they do that by reading their lives into the book they are reading. In other words, there begins to be a confusion for them between the fictional story of the romance and their own interpersonal story at the time that they're reading it. It's a dangerous allegory for Dante of the power of reading in general, especially the power of reading problematically fictive books. Think about Plato worrying about tragedy here. Paolo and Francesca, though, are caught in flagrante, right, in flagrant sexual intercourse, in bed together by her husband, who is also, by the way, Paolo's brother, and they are killed by him in a fit of fury. They end up in hell. Dante knows their story in life, and so in the tour of hell, he finds them there. There, in hell, they are condemned to run in a circle, trying to catch each other endlessly. And they never are able properly to actually realize their consummation. What's interesting about this story, when they tell it to Dante, is that they both blame the book that they were reading for their affair. That is, they don't take responsibility themselves. Dante hears their story, and just as they were overwhelmed by the passions of the book, Dante is overwhelmed by pity for them, by pietà for them. And at the end of their story, he faints. In this episode, hearing Dante is just as vulnerable as they are to passion and sympathy, we discover that, in fact, Dante has not yet understood that he is, in fact, responsible for his emotional responses to situations. He doesn't see the sympathy that he has is dangerous in this situation. At the beginning of the Inferno, that is, Dante suffers from a kind of theological Stockholm syndrome, an infernal Stockholm syndrome, where it's easy for him to feel pity for people, even in situations where pity is properly inappropriate. And Virgil, his guide in the Inferno, is trying to tell him this throughout. But the only way he learns is by beginning to see over time, by meeting and interviewing the damned again and again, by beginning to see that they are damned for a reason. Adulterers, deceivers, murderers, cannibals, traitors. The details of all their crimes differ, but they all share one thing in common. They never owned up to what they had done or what they had thereby become. They never came to terms with what they had done. And in refusing to acknowledge that, in indulging in that kind of self-deception, each person's soul has been warped in some particular way. And that warping now, after their deaths, cannot be undone. And interestingly, part of what it means for their warping to not be able to be undone is that none of the damned in hell wish that warping to be undone. None of them want to leave. You hear no true repentance in hell. There's much grief and many requests for pity, but no repentance. None of them actually want to get out. We know this from the beginning, although we don't really realize it, because as they walk through hell, they realize the gates of hell have been smashed down and broken open by Jesus Christ's descent into hell to rescue those who really want to leave, right? In other words, hell is a prison whose gate is open. True piety, then, before this situation, is to have no pity for the damned, because pity for the damned is impious. As Virgil teaches Dante in a famous line, here pietà lives when it is quite dead. Right? In other words, and there's a play on pity and piety in that one, here piety lives when pity is quite dead. That's the crucial thing. And pity lives only when piety is quite dead. True piety for the real Dante, as Dante comes to see over the course of the poem, is thus to see and judge the damned as God sees and judges them. And he, in fact, develops a kind of maturity and ability to see properly over the course of the whole book. Near the end of the book, he interviews one of the people who are trapped in ice near the bottom of hell. The bottom of hell, by the way, is not flames, it's ice, which is interesting in itself. But in interviewing this person, the person says, well, will you help me by alleviating the pain from my eyes, by wiping the ice away from my eyes? And Dante says, if I refuse to do that, let me go to the bottom of the ice, which of course is where he's going because he's going to go see Satan at the bottom of the ice, right? So he's kind of lying to the damned person, but of course the damned person doesn't know that, so the damned person thinks he's made a promise to do this. And then when Dante refuses to, after he's interviewed him, Dante says to us, the audience, he says, to be rude to him was cortesia, was courtesy. To be villano to him, to be a villain to him, was to be courteous. To be a villain to the damned is the right thing to do, right? What is it that Dante comes to know in this journey that shapes his perceptions in this way? To understand this, you have to understand the nature of infernal punishment itself, which means understanding the meaning of the logic of this term in Italian, contrapasso, counter-punishment. That is the way that in hell, each person's punishment perfectly fits their defining crime, the crime that defines the particular subspecies of malice that they most determinately indulged in. Indeed, each punishment, in a way, is a kind of cryptogram, a coded message that needs to be decoded by us who see it, Dante who sees it, and through Dante's eyes, we the audience, in order to see the moral reality it represents. This counts for all the punishments, including the ultimate punishment reserved for Satan at the very bottom of hell itself. Each one of these punishments raises all sorts of deep and interesting questions about the moral psychology of evildoers, and in particular, about whether they can ever really, wholly and purely, without any second thoughts, genuinely will the evil that they do, or whether their conscience inevitably tells against them. And this is because of the crucial thing about all of these people. In some sense, they all like their punishments. They all seem to endorse them in some important way. They don't want to leave, they complain about them, but it's like characters in the TV show Seinfeld. They just never change, right? Nothing about them ever changes, including the fact that even though they moan and whine about the punishments, nonetheless, there's something about them that they don't seem to mind. The punishments seem what they wanted all along. And this gets us back to the most famous lines in the poem, the lines that have regrettably had the most immediate impact in human history. Let me read them for you, and then I'll say something about that impact. These are, of course, the words on the sign at the top above the broken gates of hell. Everyone knows the last line, but you have to understand there are 9 lines of verse. It's a big sign, but there are 9 lines of verse above this gate, and each of them is enormously important. Through me the way to the city of woe. Through me the way to eternal pain. Through me the way among the lost people. Listen to this part. Justice moved my most high maker. Okay, justice, we can accept that. What made me was divine power. Certainly, power. The highest wisdom and the primal love. Before me nothing was created that was not eternal, and I endure eternally. Abandon every hope, you who enter. Think about this. Well, there's a lot to think about in this passage. Most disquietingly, and as I said before, the most direct historical implication of this passage is very disquieting, and that is, of course, that the gate to Auschwitz in the Holocaust had over it a sign as well. And that sign said, Arbeit macht frei. Work will make you free. And clearly, that sign was modeled on Dante's Inferno's sign. In other words, the diabolical minds, very cultured, but very diabolical, who designed the death camp of Auschwitz, actually quoted a fictional text about hell in an elusive way, but nonetheless, there's a clear allusion there to Dante in designing their death camp. That's an extremely disquieting historical thought. We'll come back to other dimensions of the Holocaust later. But for now, let's go back to Dante and that remarkable 9-line series on what hell is. Think about this for Dante. Don't think about the abandoned hope yet. You'll have to think about that later. That's a much different line than you think it is. Think about this. Hell was made not just by God's justice, that makes complete sense, but by God's love, right? The primal love is what makes hell. What does it mean for the highest love to create a hell? That is, in some important ways, the biggest question at the heart of Dante's picture of hell. And when Dante comes to see the meaning of that, Dante can then come to understand why, in fact, piety lives here when pity is quite dead, right? Now consider Satan for a second. The last of the damned they see, the king of the damned, the mayor of hell, but also in some important way, the first inmate of hell. Look at his condition. He's half sunk in the frozen ice lake at the bottom of hell. His wings are beating furiously as he is trying, apparently, to escape the ice. But he's also got in his three mouths, the mouths are themselves a parody of the Trinity. He's also got the three greatest traitors of human history, Brutus and Cassius, two Roman traitors, and then Judas Iscariot. And he's chewing them. He's desperately trying to chew them out of his mouth so that he could, breathe, talk, do anything. But of course, their bodies are continually being reintegrated by God's grace in such a way that they are inevitably needing to be chewed more, right? So Satan is kind of being force-fed the greatest traitors of all of reality. And in this situation, which is interesting in so many ways, of course, Dante and Virgil, his guide, can't speak to Satan. Satan has these traitors in his mouths, but there's no attempt to communicate with Satan at all. They only watch, they only see. In some sense, there's no way to communicate with this epitome of evil. All you can see, all you can do is observe it. And what is it that they observe? Let's think about Satan's position for a minute. Why is he trapped in this lake of ice? Well, because the ice is frozen and he's half sunk in it. But why is the ice frozen? It's because his own wings are beating. That is, his very attempt to escape the ice is what is locking him ever more firmly in the ice. Now, why is he here at the bottom of hell? What is this about? Why is he down here? Why isn't he in some, castle in the center of hell? Well, again, he's really not the mayor of hell. He's really hell's first inmate. Hell itself is a vast crater created by Satan's plummeting fall from heaven. And at the bottom of that crater, at the dead center of damnation, is where Satan has come to rest. But again, why is Satan resting there? Is he resting? I don't think so. I don't think there's any rest involved for Satan. He's desperate to flee. But what is it exactly he's fleeing? What exactly is he trying to do? Just get out of the ice? It turns out it's more complicated than that. As Dante and Virgil climb out of hell, they go over to Satan's body and then climb down his legs, right? Out of hell. It turns out that as they climb down, they have to turn around and start climbing up again. Not up his body, but they have to, directionality itself reverses on Satan. It turns out, in other words, that hell itself has all been upside down. And as they get out, crawling off of Satan's, I think it's his feet, that's when they get outside and they first see the stars. And it's Easter morning, right? That's the great parody of this, is that it starts on Good Friday when they enter hell, and they get out, not as a parody so much, it's a great allegory. They get out of hell on Easter morning, following Jesus, right? But the crucial thing here is that Satan is upside down in the ice from the perspective of the rest of reality. And what does that mean? That from the soles of Satan's feet, they can look up, and there is the Mount of Paradise on top of which is God. In other words, Satan is locked in the ice, and he's not just trying to escape the ice, he's still trying to get away from God. Now here's the astonishing thought. Satan is in some sense condemning himself to be in hell by his own activity. As I've said, people are in hell in some sense because they want to be there. Only in the 20th century, I think, in C.S. Lewis's wonderful little allegory, The Great Divorce, do we come across a similar view of what hell is. And the upshot of all this is that hell is not essentially an extrinsic punishment for people who have been bad. Hell is in some important way intrinsic to their sins themselves. Now, an extrinsic punishment is getting a spanking for taking your sister's candy, right? The spanking is extrinsic to the act of taking the candy. It's outside of that act. It's not necessarily part of the act of robbery. It is a separate thing that happens to you as a kind of consequence by your parents of you stealing the candy. An intrinsic punishment is what happens to you when you get violently sick after you've crammed down your gullet all of your sister's candy. Then the sickness is very consequentially related to the eating of the candy and to its theft, right? Hell is not extrinsic to the crimes for which the damned are sent there. That was Dante's problem with Paolo and Francesca. He thought, oh, these poor people just fell in love. Who can really blame them for that? It wasn't so much the falling in love. It was the falling in love, committing adultery, and then refusing to own up to what they had done. And in doing those things, the point is for Dante, these people, in refusing to own up for what they have done, are already saying they don't want to be around God. They don't want to be around the truth. They want to live in a kind of duplicitous place. Hell, for Dante, is that place. Hell is just the extension of the damned's crimes. They're full flowering. Hell is what evil has wanted to be for Dante all along. Consider all the damned. They have profoundly mixed desires. They have ambivalent longings. Think about Satan again. On the one hand, Satan wants more than anything else not to serve God, not to work in God's system, not to be a part of God's great plan. Satan's motto could be, I will not serve, right? Non serviam in Latin. But here's the catch, and think back to Aquinas or Anselm on this. Everything that is, including Satan, in Satan's very being, is part of God's system. Thus, Satan's real desire is, in some way, not to be at all. Think back to Aquinas. Dante actually slightly disagrees with Aquinas here. He says, even though Satan might not be able to say this to himself, that is actually Satan's real longing. Satan's rebellion, Satan's sin, is not actually an imposition against God. It is most basically a form of flight. A form of flight that longs to take the ultimate flying out of the way as possible. That is the ultimate metaphysical form, which is self-annihilation. But Satan, just because Satan is a being, a creature of God, and finds his own being good, also cannot but want to preserve that being, to continue in existence. So Satan's most essential desire, not to be a part of God's creation, conflicts with the foundations of Satan's own essential being. And Satan wants to be and not be at the same time, right? Much like a teenager in this way. Satan has created the crater we saw that's at the bottom of hell. And Satan is at the bottom of that crater, sunk in that frozen lake. A lake frozen and kept frozen by the furious beating of Satan's own wings. But his desire is not simply to flee that lake. Remember that his desire is to keep going this way, because down that way, he's realized, he's upside down. Down that way is God. In other words, Satan's own captivity is not only imposed by Satan on himself, but is imposed by Satan on himself, by God in the background, as a way of stopping Satan's flight. All of this is a tremendous symbol of Satan's confusion. But what is the contrapasso here for Satan? What is the real punishment that Satan is enduring? Is it just being frozen in a lake and being forced to eat some bad people? That doesn't seem like much. I mean, we've seen people split from head to toe, cut in two. We've seen people eating each other earlier in the Inferno. Remember, every punishment is a cryptogram of the sin that it punishes. Well, what was the real sin of Satan? The real sin of Satan was his desire to escape God, escape God's service. I really think that Satan, on Satan's business cards, has Satan, non serviam, I do not serve. Like, that's Satan's motto. That's his corporate logo. What then, if that is Satan's sin, not to want to serve? What is the quintessential punishment, the thing that would turn that sin against itself? Of course, it is to serve as the absolute linchpin of hell itself. To become the vehicle whereby God makes hell, and to be the instrument of the darkest punishment of the lowest of the traitors at the base of hell. Satan's sin is to desire not to serve God, and Satan's punishment is precisely to become one of the greatest servants of God one could be. And think about this just one more step. What would stop Satan from being trapped here? Why, nothing more than stopping beating his own wings. It's they, after all, that freeze his body into the lake. Why doesn't he just do that? And this reveals the incredible irony in the sign above the gate at the entry to hell. On that sign, that last line, "Abandon all hope, you who enter here," can sound like oh, just give up now. You better just give up all hope. In fact, it also means something else. It means get over your false hopes. Leave your spin behind, and you might be able to leave. If you want out of hell, all you have to do is give up hope of getting yourself out of hell, and then you can just walk out. Above the gates of hell are the instructions for escaping hell. So Satan is truly punished precisely because he wants to not serve the good by serving the good. But is that punishment? Who doesn't want to serve the good? Only insane people would do that, perhaps. Well, is Satan insane? In a way, maybe. I mean, he wants to die as thoroughly as anyone can genuinely want that end. But that's not a perfect and wholehearted desire, because no creature can desire that wholeheartedly. So Satan is, again, most fundamentally confused, ambivalent. God lets Satan have Satan's way as far as is possible. God lets Satan do what Satan wants. But still, Satan's actual desire can't finally make sense, and Satan can't get outside of being God's creature. Hell, then, is self-made and self-inflicted. It's chosen in some profound but utterly mysterious way by the damned. They don't just get what they deserve, that is. They get what, in some utterly mysterious way, they actually want. Now, Dante's picture of evil is not properly understood here as direct advice about how to deal with the realities of evil and suffering in this life. That's not his aim in this poem. His aim is really indirectly useful for that, but its central purpose is the spiritual and ethical re-education of one soul in our life, a soul who has lost his way, personified in the character Dante in the poem, but really referring to all of us in this life, wandering as we all are in our own dark woods. Sometimes, and for some of us, more dark than others. The poem, then, is really an effort to help us resist the enormous tidal power of the habituated sin of our world, sin in which we more or less all heartily participate, and to teach us to replace that habituated sinful vision with a new vision of good and evil. Remember here Augustine saying he wanted to teach us how not to know what we should not know. Only insofar as the poem does that, only insofar as it teaches us to see through evil's spurious self-presentation, can it have any practical effects on our world. And this is the lesson about evil that Dante most desperately wants to teach. From Dante now, we're going to move to a very different context, the one that is, in important ways, not entirely disanalogous to Dante's own. And that will be the Reformation.